Ever get that feeling? Like you've really climbed high in your field, the view's familiar, but maybe there's something more. If you shifted your perspective just a bit, like you know how to use your tools, but what if you re-examine their basic physics, you know?
I get that. Expertise can be like a really refined lens, but sometimes it's a bit narrow.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we're doing today, a deep dive. Now you, dear listener, you've clearly mastered your field. We can tell from what you've shared. We're not trying to teach you something brand new within that.
This is more about looking at the foundations of how you think. Not questioning your expertise, but the universal principles behind good thinking, making decisions, really getting the world. Principles that work no matter what you're an expert in.
Exactly. Like a master craftsperson, sometimes they go back to basics, the raw materials, right? So our guide today is Seeking Wisdom by Peter Bevelin, Darwin to Munger, the whole deal. We're pulling out the core stuff, the insights that are powerful, whether you're a veteran or just starting out. It's about strengthening the base of your expert intuition.
What's really interesting for someone at your level is how looking at these basic principles can reveal biases you didn't see or new ways of doing things.
Right. Okay, let's get into it. Starting with something that might seem odd for an expert, admitting you don't know everything. Montaigne said, anyone who wants to be cured of ignorance must first admit to it.
That's,
Yeah.
yeah, powerful, especially when you've spent years learning so much. Being an expert can trick you into thinking you know it all. It makes it harder to see what you don't know, both in your field and in general.
Right. It's not about pretending you're clueless in your area. It's about always remembering how much is still out there, unknown, even in related fields or in the basic ideas behind your own expertise. Like Charlie Munger, he's always saying, gotta get the big ideas that underlie reality. Even if you're a specialist, you benefit from going back to those big ideas from all sorts of fields.
If we connect this to what you do every day, think about a tough problem you had recently. Was there a time when realizing you didn't know something, maybe outside your specialty, helped you find a better solution?
And here's where it gets really interesting. Bevelin talks about Darwin's idea that you don't have to be a genius to outthink others. You just need the right thinking habits. Now, you've obviously got the smarts, but how often are you consciously using the best thinking habits, even on familiar problems?
That's crucial. Deep knowledge is like the raw material, but it doesn't make you immune to biases or bad logic. Those are just human things. Even experts fall for them if they don't use good thinking habits on purpose.
And Bevelin's book gives us a framework for this. He looks at what influences our thinking, the psychology of bad judgments, even how basic physics and math can trip us up. Then he gives tools for better thinking and wisdom from guys like Munger and Bucket, even checklists we can use. It's a whole toolkit for any smart person who wants to think even better.
For an expert like you, it's not about new facts in your field. It's about using this framework to really examine how you make your expert judgments.
Let's look at some of those reasons for misjudgment Bevelin talks about and see if they might apply even at an expert level, like over-influenced by vivid or the most recent information.
Think about the newest stuff in your field. Even though you know the basic principles so well, could a really exciting new finding, maybe one with a great story attached to it, be swaying you too much? Maybe you're overlooking a lot of older data that's not as flashy, even if it's more solid.
That's a good question. We all love a good story, Rose.
Mhm.
What about the bias from reciprocation tendency, that human thing where we want to return favors?
Think about working with others in your field. Could little favors from the past, even if you barely remember them, be affecting how you judge those people or their work now?
And what about the bias from over-influence by authority? How does that work when you're an expert dealing with other big names in your area?
Even though you're an expert yourself, when you're talking to those really respected figures, how do you make sure you're still thinking for yourself? You're not just swayed by what they say because of who they are.
Sense-making? Wanting to quickly figure things out? That seems extra relevant for experts. They've got those mental models, right?
Those models are powerful, yeah, but they can also make you jump to conclusions too fast. You slot new information into your existing categories and maybe miss something new or something that doesn't quite fit.
Confirmation bias, classic one. Looking for information that supports what we already believe.
Let's say your expertise is in. Mention a hypothetical area of listeners' expertise. Can you think of a time when you might have unconsciously looked for data that fit a theory you had for a long time and maybe downplayed other viewpoints because of that?
Consistency and commitment bias, sticking to what you've said or done before, even when new information comes up.
Think about a strong opinion you've had or a project you really pushed for. How do you make sure you can reevaluate your commitment even if the new data goes against what you thought before? And are you being influenced by things like the lowball or labeling techniques Bevelin talks about, even without realizing it?
Loss aversion. That feeling that being wrong is way worse than being right is good. Could this make an expert less willing to change their mind?
In your field, is there a new approach that might be better but also riskier? Are you avoiding it because you're afraid of being wrong, even if the payoff could be huge?
Envy and jealousy. Maybe not so obvious, but could these feelings affect even professional judgments?
Think about times you've judged the work of your colleagues. Could any unconscious comparisons, or maybe a little bit of envy, have affected your opinion even if you thought you were being totally objective?
Contrast, misreaction. Misjudging gradual changes because we're comparing to the wrong things.
In a field that changes slowly, what are the specific metrics or benchmarks you look at to make sure you're not missing big trends? You don't want to just compare to what happened last week or to something that's not really relevant.
Over-influenced by frequencies versus probabilities. How the data is presented, that can really affect how an expert sees risk, right?
When you're looking at data, are you more swayed by how many times something happened or by the actual probability? And how do you make sure the way the data is shown isn't tricking you into seeing risk where there isn't any, or vice versa?
Social proof. The idea that if no one disagrees, it must be right. How can experts avoid that pressure to conform?
In those big discussions, those important ones in your field, how do you make sure people feel comfortable disagreeing? You don't want silence to mean agreement when there are doubts or other viewpoints.
Back to over-influenced by authority. Thinking about those Milgram experiments. Chilling stuff.
Even if a really famous paper in your field makes a big claim, what questions do you always ask yourself about their methods or what they're assuming before you just accept what they're saying?
Hindsight bias. Thinking we knew it all along. A classic trap.
Think about a major event in your field, a big discovery. How do you make sure you're not fooling yourself into thinking it was inevitable? And how does that affect your predictions for the future or how you assess risk?
Reason respecting. Needing reasons, even for things we strongly believe. Experts, they love a good reason.
Of course, solid reasoning is at the heart of expertise. But how do you make sure you're not just trying to justify what you already believe? That you're truly open to evidence that might go against your basic assumptions?
Memory limitations. Even the most knowledgeable experts, they're human. Their memory isn't perfect. How can this affect their work?
With all the information you deal with, what systems do you use to make up for the fact that human memory isn't perfect, so you don't miss crucial details?
Influence of emotions. Experts, they still feel things.
Think about a time you had to make a tough decision under pressure. How did you keep track of your emotions to make sure they weren't clouding your judgment?
Stress. Being an expert can be stressful.
What do you do to manage stress and keep thinking clearly, especially when you're dealing with difficult or important issues?
And lastly, role and self-interest bias. How your job or what you personally want can subtly affect your work.
Think about your current position and where you want to go in your career. Could these things, even unconsciously, be influencing your research choices, the way you interpret things, or the recommendations you make?
Wow, that's quite a list of potential problems. But Bevelin doesn't just point them out. He gives us tools to think better. One that's especially relevant for experts is checklists.
For an expert, a good checklist isn't about reminding you of basic stuff. It's a way to make sure you don't skip important steps, even the obvious ones, especially when things are complex or the stakes are high. It's a way to force yourself to be thorough, even when you think you've got it all figured out. The checklist has to be practical and focused on avoiding the specific mistakes that matter most in your field.
It's about being thorough, even when you trust your intuition.
Exactly. Another great tool, especially for experts who are good at strategic thinking, is Buffett's question, and then what?
Yeah, it makes you think beyond the immediate consequences, right?
Right. When an expert's making a theory or a big decision, and then what? Makes them think not just about the first outcome, but about the chain reaction, the second, third, even long-term effects. It helps them see the whole system, not just their little piece of it.
Anticipate the ripples, so to speak.
Mhm.
Understanding probabilities, avoiding misinterpretations, that's key too, especially when you're dealing with data, like the base rate fallacy, the cab color problem. That shows how easy it is to mess this up.
When you analyze data, how do you make sure you're not overemphasizing new, exciting findings and forgetting about how common things are in general? The base rates, the prior probabilities, those matter.
And not getting too confident about what your findings really mean. Like with complex statistics, it's easy to overstate things.
When you're looking at stats, especially in, let's say, mention a hypothetical statistical application in listener's field, how do you keep statistical significance and practical significance separate in your mind? And how do you make sure you're not making things sound more certain than they are when you're explaining your conclusions? Got to remember the comparison groups, the sample sizes, all that. Expected value, that's important too when you're assessing risks and potential rewards.
Jacoby's advice to always invert, thinking backward. How can experts use that?
Instead of just focusing on how to succeed, try spending time thinking about what you don't want to happen. If you figure out what could go wrong, the bad consequences you want to avoid, you often get a much clearer picture of what really matters and what you need to do to protect yourself from those risks. It's like strengthening your plans by looking for weak points.
So we're back to the basics, continuous learning, intellectual humility, the cornerstones, right?
Yeah. For an expert, learning isn't about the basics anymore. It's about constantly getting better, keeping up with the new stuff, really thinking critically about new ideas, even if they challenge what you thought you knew. Intellectual humility means knowing that even though you're an expert, you still don't know everything. And you're open to changing your mind when new evidence comes along, even from fields you don't know much about. Just like Munger says, think about things from different angles.
So to wrap it all up, we've seen how these basic principles from Bevelin's Seeking Wisdom, they're not just for beginners. They're essential tools for even the most accomplished experts. Continuous learning, being humble about what you know, knowing about your own biases, these aren't just nice to have, they're crucial if you want to stay at the top of your game. This deep dive, it's all about making your expert thinking even stronger.
Thinking back on all this, which reason for misjudgment do you think applies most to the problems you're facing right now?
For me, it's the "and then what" question, thinking about the long-term impact of decisions. It's easy to get focused on the immediate goals and forget about the chain reaction that comes after.
Yeah, I see that. I think the most important thing for an expert to remember is that they have to constantly check how they're thinking, not just the results of their work.
So knowing that we all have confirmation bias, what are you going to do to find viewpoints that really challenge your main theories or methods, really push you to think differently?
And if we think about always invert, what's one way your most important project could fail? And what can you do right now to make sure that doesn't happen?
It seems like true expertise isn't just about how much you know, it's also about being smart enough to constantly check and improve how you learn and use that knowledge. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been great.
My pleasure.